Okay, so we're taking a deep dive today
into these excerpts you shared, and wow, it's really like opening a time capsule
of political thought.
Absolutely.
Oh, we're going all the way back to like early Christianity
to see how how our understanding of government and community
has evolved over time.
And it's amazing how, these thinkers from centuries ago were actually grappling with like questions that are still so relevant today.
Like, where does authority really come from?
It's
humbling in a way, right? To think that these
debates have been going on for so long and we're still trying to figure it out.
So we're starting with this idea of early Christians
viewing government through this lens of judgment.
That's not how we usually think about it today, right?
Yeah. It's a different way of looking at it for sure.
But it's a powerful framework when you really think about it.
Imagine a king, not just as someone who makes laws,
but as a judge in like a cosmic courtroom.
Oh, wow.
Upholding divine law as a
representative of a higher power.
Okay, so like
King Solomon, known for his wisdom,
right,
resolving disputes. It's not so much about
writing the rules for everyone, but more about making sure
that justice is served in each specific case.
It's a much more immediate approach.
Yeah.
Much more case by case.
Than how we tend to think about government today.
But then how did we get from this idea of
divine judgment to,
we don't live in a theocracy.
Right.
We have these whole systems of human-made laws.
Exactly. And that's where the Middle Ages get really interesting.
Because you have thinkers like Thomas Aquinas,
who reintroduced this idea of human-made law, or what they called lex humana. Lex humana, human law.
But, and this is a crucial point, Aquinas argued that
even these human laws, they couldn't just be like anything goes.
Right.
So humans didn't suddenly have free reign to just make up whatever laws they wanted. There had
to be a framework.
Yeah.
And for Aquinas, that framework was that these laws could not.
They could not contradict divine law.
So there's still that
higher moral order.
That higher authority.
That even human laws had to answer to.
And that makes you think, like, even today.
Do we judge the legitimacy of laws?
Based on some kind of innate sense of right and wrong.
Right, like where do we...
Or what happens?
When those things clash.
Exactly, where's that line?
Yeah.
That's something I think we've all probably
thought about at some point or another, but...
I wanna stick with...
the historical thread for now.
Sure.
Because we get to the late Middle Ages.
And there's another, like, seismic shift that happens.
Tell me about William of Ockham and this whole...
Okay, so
this concept of subjective rights.
William of Ockham, he's really interesting because...
this is where we start to see the individual...
taking center stage.
Okay.
So imagine, like, the freedom to practice your religion.
Without being persecuted for it.
Yeah.
Or...
the right to speak your mind.
Without fear of being silenced.
Right.
These are rights that are, like, inherent to you.
Simply because you're human.
So it's not even about...
It's not about being granted... these freedoms.
It's that there's something you inherently have.
Wow, that's a
huge shift.
That's a huge shift.
And as you can imagine, it created some friction, some tension.
Yeah.
Because this new focus on the individual.
It kind of put a new kind of pressure on those traditional ideas.
Like community and authority that we were talking about before.
Expert. It's like we're seeing the first seeds of this tension between individual liberties and like what the community as a whole needs.
Something you were talking about earlier. It's
something we're still dealing with.
Absolutely, yeah.
But how did these thinkers...
back then, how did they...
kind of square this new focus on individual rights with the idea of community, which was so central back then?
Right, because community was still such a
powerful force, and I think...
one of the most, like, radical interpretations of that comes from...
the Franciscan tradition, of all places.
Right, the Franciscans, those are the monks who, like...
took vows of poverty, right? How did that get to individual rights?
It's not just about individual poverty.
It's about something much, much deeper.
Right.
Thinkers like Bonaventure and John Wycliffe.
They saw this as a path to something really radical, something they called...
non-proprietary community.
Okay, I'm going to need you to...
I'm going to need you to unpack that a little.
Yeah.
Non-proprietary community.
It's not exactly a phrase you hear every day.
No, it's not.
Essentially, it means a community where no one really owns anything.
Where the whole concept of individual ownership is rejected.
So, like, everything's shared.
Everything is shared.
Wow. As a common good.
I'm trying to wrap my head around
what that would even look like. It's so different from
how our world works, where property rights are like so fundamental.
Yeah, that's the thing. It was much more of
A utopian ideal, a way of challenging the very foundations of
how society was structured.
So less about a practical plan and more about kind of like a thought experiment almost.
Yeah, like how do we even
conceive of these things?
Yeah.
And it gets at those core questions we're still wrestling with.
Right, that tension we were talking about.
Exactly.
Between the needs of everyone and the rights of each person.
Exactly.
That makes you wonder, like,
is there some kind of middle ground?
Between, like, absolute individual ownership and a world where
no one owns anything.
All right, where does that line fall?
Yeah, is there a way to create a system
that's more just, more equitable?
It's a question worth asking.
Yeah, and speaking of kind of challenging the status quo,
we can't forget Erasmus. The Renaissance humanist,
who had some pretty pointed critiques about
oh yeah, he was
about the hypocrisy he saw in the church and society.
He was not afraid to call it out.
Yeah, and he was known for his wit.
His satire.
Oh, absolutely.
He wrote The Praise of Folly, right? He really skewers those in power.
Yeah.
Exposes their corruption, their greed.
But how does that
connect to what we've been talking about?
So for Erasmus, true Christian community.
It wasn't about like rituals or wealth or any of that. It was about truly living by the principles of Christ's teachings.
So less about the letter of the law and more about the spirit of it.
Exactly.
I see. So for him,
real change had to start with the individual.
It had to start from within.
Okay.
This kind of spiritual renewal.
But then it makes you think, right? Like, is that enough?
If every single person underwent
this transformation, would that be enough to create
real change in the world?
Right. Is it just about individuals?
Or do we need to address the system itself?
Or are there systems in place that kind of work against that?
To perpetuate injustice no matter how.
How virtuous individuals try to be.
Right. It's that age-old question.
That's a big question.
Yeah, and it gets even more complicated.
As we move into the modern era and the rise of the nation state.
The nation state?
That's a whole other
ballgame.
Where do we even begin with that?
Well, I think one of the most fascinating things
how deep
the idea of a nation
is rooted in theology.
Hold on, are you saying that
the whole idea of a nation
has like religious origins?
It goes way back. I have never thought about it like that.
Yeah, think about
the Old Testament.
Okay.
The idea of Israel as, God's chosen people.
Bound by a covenant and this shared history.
That idea had a huge influence on Western thought.
So like this feeling we have, this sense of
belonging, of shared destiny, that we associate with a nation.
That has theological roots. That's fascinating.
It really does, yeah.
But it starts to change as we move into the modern world.
And the idea of a nation, it starts to kind of detach
from these religious foundations.
Okay.
And we see the rise of what we call the civic nation.
The civic nation.
Which emphasizes shared values, shared rights.
So less about where you come from and more about what you believe.
Exactly.
That seems like it could be a really
powerful force for inclusivity.
It could, in theory, yeah.
Bringing people from all different backgrounds together.
Under a common set of ideals.
Right, that's the hope.
Yeah, but I imagine that shift.
From a theological to this civic understanding of a nation.
It wasn't without its challenges.
No, it definitely came with some baggage.
What do you mean?
Well, it brought with it, a kind of
cultural homogenization.
Like a sense that everywhere was starting to look
and feel the same.
Okay, so like when you travel.
And every airport you go to.
Exactly.
No matter where you are.
It all looks the same.
Starts to look the same. Yeah, that sense of placelessness.
Exactly.
We lose that.
That unique character.
So it's like.
On the one hand, you have this.
Attempt to create this universal sense of belonging.
But on the other hand, you risk kind of erasing.
What makes each place, each community unique?
Exactly.
It's a tough needle to thread.
Yeah.
So it's like we're caught in this tension between
wanting to feel connected to something bigger than ourselves.
But also wanting to hold on to
what makes each place unique.
That's that balance, right?
Right. Is there even a way to have both?
That's the question.
And it feels like something that plays out, not just on a global scale, but like
in our own communities, even in our own lives,
Absolutely. And I think that's why
looking back at these thinkers, it can actually
give us some really
some surprising insights, you know, because remember how we were talking about that
kind of pendulum swing between like
individual rights and the needs of the collective.
Right. Starting all the way back with those
early Christian ideas of government as judgment, and then
moving into like subjective rights.
and that same tension.
It plays out on a global scale when we talk about something like
UN Declaration of Human Rights.
okay,
Because it's an attempt to say
okay, here are some fundamental values.
unify everywhere.
Right.
But then the question becomes,
What happens when those universal ideals bump up
the
against
specific values
right?
of a particular culture or a nation.
It makes you think about like
Well, those debates that we see playing out, like
freedom of expression versus like hate speech laws.
exactly.
Where do you even draw the line
Right. Where's that line?
between protecting individual rights
And making sure that the community as a whole,
is safe and flourishing?
and who gets to decide?
Right, exactly.
That's the $1 million question.
And going back to the sources you shared, it's interesting to me
Some of these tensions were actually like,
prefigured centuries ago. You know?
they saw it coming, didn't they?
It's like they saw it coming.
Like, take, for example, the Franciscans.
Who, took this idea of
This
community.
is such a radical level, like rejecting individual ownership altogether.
Right, like no private property.
Right. And it's like,
Could you even imagine that on a global scale?
it's hard to fathom.
It's hard to even picture it
But it's interesting as
as a thought experiment,
okay.
Because it shows you, like,
the extreme end of that spectrum.
okay,
Right. So on the one hand, you have
this vision of complete,
that like collective unity.
okay,
And then on the other, you have this like
hyper-individualistic approach where,
everyone's just looking out for themselves.
right, and the real challenge is
Finding that
balance, that sweet
spot. Yeah. That middle ground
where we can
honor both.
honor individual rights, but also recognize
That we're part of something larger.
exactly.
It's easy to get
Yeah.
really caught up in the extremes.
It's so easy to go to one side or the other.
Right. Exactly.
But it's that middle path
Yeah,
that I think
yeah.
is so important.
Well, you give us,
A lot to think about today.
I always say that at the end of these, but like,
I really mean it.
as you should,
This has been like
a real,
a big question.
yeah, big questions.
And I think,
If there's one thing we can take away,
from these thinkers, from all these different perspectives we've been looking at,
is that these questions of justice,
of authority, of how we structure,
our communities, our societies,
they don't have easy answers.
yeah,
They require us
to
to
really think critically,
okay,
to be willing to have those difficult conversations.
and to be willing to change our minds.
Exactly. Because the world's changing
Right.
and our thinking has to evolve with it.
It's a little daunting.
But also, I think, kind of inspiring
well, it is inspiring.
to be part of that ongoing conversation.
Absolutely.
So to everyone listening,
And you go about your day.
think about this.
If you could design a global society from scratch
How would you balance the rights of the individual?
with the needs of the collective,
It's a good question.
what values would you prioritize?
How would you make sure that everyone's voice is heard?
It's a thought-provoking challenge.
It is
And one that I think is definitely worth
worth wrestling with.
absolutely, yeah.
So on that note,
We'll leave it there for today.
like that.